nightmare to others!
Today on the Restitutor Orbis channel, we explore the account of Jules Verne, the author who lived from 1828 to 1905. Jules Verne, the seemingly prophetic science fiction author, although his literary style was called Romanticism at the time, who was born in Nantes, France. A very interesting individual who lived during that questionable time frame of the 1800s. Why does Jules Verne warrant our attention? It would seem that Jules Verne was the visionary who contrived many of the ideas of wondrous technological advancements that would supposedly come out of the 1800s and then play a key role to this day in the 1900s and the so-called 21st century. Whatever year it actually is, we can certainly debate on that. But Jules Verne is interesting because we have few images of him due to the fact that he was born prior to the invention of the camera and the fact that his life seemed to have many different twists and turns to it. We're going to examine the background of Jules Verne's life and how he grew up in Nantes, France, and became the actual author that he is. He was also an accomplished poet and a playwright, as many people seem to be during that time. Although to give him credit, he didn't actually have avocations. His desire to be an author was his primary profession, which makes him quite unique in the annals of the 1800s. When we look at the background of Nantes, France, we see many wondrous examples of old world architecture. And of course, the mainstream explanation for this will be, well, this is France. This is part of Europe. They had hundreds of years to build all these wondrous structures. And of course, if you watch any modern movies that are set in France, you'll see no shortage of examples of old world architecture. Nantes, France is no exception to this. Being located only about 30 miles from the Atlantic, it's a wondrous and beautiful community to this very day. Of course, I'm sure there's somebody out there that'll disagree with that assessment, but looking at the images and having the fact that this is the city where the great Jules Verne hails from, and it should be noted that Jules Verne is very well known. Although, of course, Nantes, France has its unfortunate elements of history, as every other area in the world does, such as with the French Revolution. We can certainly see, though, that this would be a city that would inspire somebody such as Jules Verne with its impressive architecture and its very rich cultural background. It should be noted that Jules Verne's family wanted him to pursue the legal profession, especially his father. And indeed, this was a point of contention between Jules Verne and his father. His father wanted him to follow in the legal profession, and therefore sent him off to Paris to be educated in law. But Jules Verne persisted. He wanted to be an author, as he felt that was his primary calling. And when you look at some of the more specific examples in Nantes, France, you'll see that there's no shortage of incredible cathedrals, such as the eponymous Nantes Cathedral, where they're supposedly renovating it, and that explains why we have this color difference. Considering the account of this very cathedral in Nantes, they were allegedly building it for over 100 years. Yes, another one of these cathedrals that they built over 100 years, and yet managed to maintain consistency and continuity in the construction, and managed to lay it out with total geometric precision. Yes, once again, another example of tremendous and incredible architecture from a time frame that was shortly after the bubonic plague had hit Europe. And again, no less impressive than the other cathedrals that you have across France and across the land. And this supposedly has a bit of a Gothic styling to it. Of course, there does seem to be other elements to it. One could understand why Jules Verne, when he was walking around the town, would be inspired by such sights as this. Although we are considering the question, did Jules Verne really exist, or is he merely a compilation individual, another individual who may have released the wonders that we have from the previous civilization? Looking inside the cathedral, again, we see examples of great architecture and geometric precision within the wondrous pillars and columns, and indeed in the arches and the ceilings. We've seen this before, and we'll see this again in our explorations. Now, no one will build like this today. We'll try to replicate it, and we have our usual reason for why we don't do it. It's too expensive, it's too difficult. We don't have craftsmen and artisans on every corner who are just hanging out waiting for employment, and we don't have the logistics capacity that we did in the 1800s for reasons unknown. Of course, this cathedral would include a wondrous and amazing organ that could no doubt transmit incredible sounds. I'm always intrigued by the effect of sounds on the human psyche and the body, and it seems that the power of sound is something that we're oftentimes quick to dismiss. We see that once again there's no shortage of modular construction within this cathedral. And so, back to the early life of Jules Verne, we have this individual who was born, and yet you would expect the society would not be supportive of someone to develop a creative mind. But there's always the exception to every rule, and there's always a polymath or someone who's brilliant wherever you need them. And when Jules Verne was actually in Paris, there was an abdication going on of the French King Louis, one of the many kings named Louis, and this also supposedly jump-started the social revolutions in 1848 across the land that we explored during the Reset War of 1847-1848. Who knows exactly what was really going on? You can still visit the museum dedicated to Jules Verne in Nantes, France to this day. And naturally, it's another old world building that we're informed was built during the 1800s. Because what else would it be? It's situated on a hill and has nothing questionable about it whatsoever. Just a nice, very pretty tower and what we might even consider more generous gingerbread construction. Or perhaps a different pattern that you might want to let me know in the comments what you think it looks like. It has a tower and it's marked as the Jules Verne Museum, and you can visit it to this day and obtain a great appreciation for this wondrous visionary and prophet. Now, if Jules Verne did really exist and his life developed as we're told, then we have someone who managed wonderful creative achievements and was somehow able to predict the exact development of technology in the 1900s to today. Very impressive achievements. And of course, Nantes includes a wondrous column, another column that's dedicated to another king named Louis. Believe me, there are no shortages of kings named Louis in France, just like there were no shortages of kings named Henry in England and France in the distant past. Some of these wondrous structures never cease to amaze me, though, with their size and eminence, and it's amazing trying to think of how the mainstream historical account justifies the construction of these very large and well-constructed buildings, some from the 1700s, and that's how they try to use the history within Europe to justify the construction, although there's also the justification of the industrial revolutions that were going on. And it should be noted that when Jules Verne lived, it was during the so-called Victorian era, when we have this other occurrence of asylums and workhouses and some of the darker sides of society. They also have a really nice arcade in Nantes, so if you're over in France, I can definitely recommend this as a wonderful old world destination to visit. And even if you don't exactly approve of these theories, it's still very pretty and there's many unique locations to see. One could understand why you'd have a great shopping experience seeing this kind of artistic and creative beauty all around you. But to this day, we have managed to establish modern skyscrapers across Europe, and it's also interesting when you go to Paris and you see how that movement has been established. But Jules Verne managed to persist in his desire to write creative novels, and that was his first calling in life, and we're going to take a close look at what he exactly wrote. It's intriguing to think of his development, though, with conflicting with his father, given his father's desire to pursue the legal profession. And how many other individuals do we have this story for when they're given a path in life and it's something that they're pushed for by their father? Typically they accede to what their father wants or their family wants. Nice theater. Again, never a shortage of theaters or opera houses with all of these wondrous details of the old world in them. And if the mainstream account is true, and if Jules Verne really was brought up in such a city, then perhaps these sites could explain how he was able to develop this creative imagination that he had in his works. This is Pierre-Jules Hetzel. This was Jules Verne's publisher and editor, and once Jules Verne met him, he was really a significant force in ensuring that his works were published. It should be noted, though, that officially Jules Verne's literary reputation has suffered, especially in the so-called English-speaking nations, at least that's what the official account says, because of the fact that many of his works were edited or abridged, and therefore many of the people, when they read Journey to the Center of the Earth, one of Jules Verne's most well-known works, they didn't read the full version of it. And so it's oftentimes attributed to just being a child's novel or something that's just the product of some wild Frenchman's imagination. And yet there is such a greater degree to Jules Verne's works, and if you decide to read his books and really indulge in his novels, I strongly suggest you read the unabridged editions. There's many interesting clues and hints and perceptions that we have in the novels that really match with the research that we do. Considering the fact, though, that these are attributed to simply be imaginatory or children's novels, funny that they even consider that when you consider how complicated they are and how deep they are in plot, you realize that Jules Verne either had some sort of template in his mind, or he must have been a creative visionary. He's also attributed across the land, for example, Jules Verne Park in Tampa, Florida. For some reason, Jules Verne is well featured in Tampa, Florida, and if anybody knows why, let me know in the comments. Yes, I know why. I would just like you to see why they concern themselves with Jules Verne in Florida. You'll get a couple hints further on in this exploration. There's even a monument to him in Spain in some of his works. So here we have an individual that was from France during the high time of nationalism who managed to surpass those bounds and be well known across the land. But who exactly did Jules Verne inspire? How did he inspire these people and why? Let's take a look at the works of Jules Verne in his books. It should be noted he was a contemporary of Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas of Three Musketeers fame. One of his earliest works was 5 Weeks in a Balloon, or Three Englishmen Go to Africa. And oddly enough, you see this theme with many of Verne's works where it involves some sort of unique form of transportation, especially for the 1800s. And indeed, this was where Verne supposedly established his reputation of being an explorer. And you can also see this theme in many of his novels where you have some advanced form of transportation, some unique technology, and Jules Verne is remembered as being sort of the father, if you will, of science fiction. We look at his next well-known novel, The Adventures of Captain Hatteras, which involve a journey to the North Pole. I can't imagine who that would have inspired in the future. And remember that this was written during the middle of the 1800s and the 1860s. And so you have these amazing adventures. And there's even an account of how when Jules Verne was a child, he listened to his teacher tell a story of someone who ended up like Robinson Crusoe. We also have a journey to the center of the earth, indeed one of the most enduring stories from Jules Verne that involves individuals exploring beneath the earth's surface. So here we have accounts of other lands, other means to access other lands using more advanced technology. Again, was this just the product of Jules Verne's imagination, or was there something else? We have From the Earth to the Moon, one of the first examples of a story of actually traveling to the moon. Although we're informed that Kepler actually had a story of this and he used his mother's spells to reach the moon, at least according to Carl Sagan. But we don't need to be mentioning Carl Sagan with Jules Verne, at least not today. And perhaps the more widely known Around the World in 80 Days, again, using advanced forms of transportation to actually traverse the land. I like how they depict the world on a flat map, but of course you're watching this on a flat screen, so you're going to see it on a flat map, which fortunately works on a flat screen. I'm just noting that. And then perhaps Jules Verne's most well-known from the 20th century work, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And we have another advanced form of transportation in the form of a submarine. Some people attribute the idea of the submarine to Jules Verne, although it should be noted that there were many ideas considered for the design of the submarine, supposedly, in the mid-1800s. You might recall when we explored the USS Alligator from the United States Navy for its employment during the Civil War. Of course, it did not have the capabilities of the Nautilus that was featured in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but there were many of the same principles. And indeed, when you see some of the artwork of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you can get an idea for the imagination in Jules Verne. And this is why I strongly recommend that you read many of his novels for yourself and get the idea of what he was truly alluding to. And then you even have one of his latter novels, The Lighthouse at the End of the World. And many ideas and great implements of technology that are featured in Jules Verne's work. But beyond that, he also features these interesting views of this struggle of humanity. Who did he inspire? Admiral Richard E. Byrd, no less, with that story of exploring the North Pole, The Adventures of Captain Hatteras. Yuri Gagarin, because if you're going to go to space, you may as well read Jules Verne's novels, or whatever space we're going to. Wernher von Braun, because he was inspired by Jules Verne as well. American rocket engineer Jack Parsons, and if you've never heard of him, I suggest you look him up. He's a very interesting individual. He has lots of interesting backgrounds, including his affiliation with Aleister Crowley. I'm not making this up. You should really read about Jack Parsons. And least we forget Dr. Emmett L. Brown, who was so inspired by Jules Verne, he invented a time machine out of a DeLorean and then named his children after Jules Verne. So let's take a look at Jules Verne's technology, or at least some of the implements of technology that were introduced to the wider population in Jules Verne's works. We have the submarine, and we talked about this concerning the Nautilus and its effects on future development. Indeed, the United States Navy's first nuclear submarine that did indeed go explore up in the polar regions, as we're told, was named the Nautilus, in honor of Jules Verne's Nautilus and Captain Nemo's Nautilus from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The intriguing thing, though, about Jules Verne is that he did inherently consider his characters, whether they were traveling under the sea, going to the moon, whatever the moon was really supposed to be within his stories. I mean, maybe it's the moon as we think of it in space. We don't really know. I certainly advise you to read the story and come to your own conclusions. There's also the inspiration that we seem to have from Verne's works, because he had an understanding of additional capabilities of a lot of these implements of technology before they were in widestream use. Indeed, Jules Verne is also credited as the innovator of the steampunk genre, the Victorian, technologically advanced civilization. Did it really exist, or was it merely a product of his imagination? There is also the influences that Jules Verne has on science fiction. I mean, it's a little bit of a joke to talk about Dr. Brown and his DeLorean, but at the same time, it's also rooted in reality. The entire concept of a submarine. How advanced could a submarine be? There are some people that suggest that submarines are completely useless from a military standpoint, although from the official history we're told that the use of an undersea U-boat force by Germany during World War I and World War II nearly brought about victory, until greater technology was developed to counter the threat of the U-boat force. Strangely enough, there's many other interesting details within Verne's works where you can see visiting other lands, other civilizations, and other implements of technology. And this is why Jules Verne is considered the father of science fiction, because if you think on this, this is the very root of what science fiction is. But is this really science fiction? Or as John Cleeko said when he was talking about Gene Roddenberry, is it actual science fact that's merely being introduced to the population as science fiction? These are interesting ideas when you step back and consider them. Now, whatever's really going on with our space program, it should be noted that there was even considered to be a ride for Jules Verne land and defunct land. And interesting, given Jules Verne's unique behind-the-scenes connections with Florida, that they considered doing this. And Jules Verne's association with airships. Now, what makes this all so interesting in this development of science fiction and these ideas of technological advancement? Where did they really come from? We're assured now that the development of the airship or the balloon was in the distant past. It was even before the 1800s. And yet, along with architecture, we have too many examples of too many things that were innovated, built, and constructed during the 1800s. And so it seems as though there's an overlap. There's a bit of an inconsistency. And so was this really just the product of the wild imagination of some random author in the 1800s who disobeyed his father's desires to become a lawyer? Or was there something more to this? Was this particular author referencing what he had known or somehow had knowledge of? Or was this merely a planned release of this knowledge, of these technological capabilities, to prepare a population for potential explorations of other lands that had been neglected, or the reintroduction of technology that was going to be used in a newer civilization? It almost seems as though it's a product of cycles, and if you step far enough back, you can get that impression. Again, this will be derided and will simply be stated that this was merely an individual who used their imagination, had an awareness of what was really going on in the 1800s, and could act in a prophetic manner, and therefore anticipate not only technological developments, but how technology was going to be applied in society. Perhaps you could argue it was because of his legal background that Jules Verne had studied, that he was able to anticipate exactly what technological advancements would be incorporated in society and exactly how they'd be incorporated. That's quite a prophetic nature that he has there, the ability to anticipate what's going on in the future. And yet that's actually one of the mainstream explanations for how he was able to anticipate all these things. Now let's look at some of Jules Verne's maps that he has in his works. Now, what's interesting about the maps? Well, we talked about several of the novels which indicate travel to very exotic locations, to include the North Pole, Under the World, and other such elements. Looking at some of these maps, though, we're told that they were inspired by other maps that we've looked at on this channel before. Maps which show areas that either were drawn by cartographers who didn't exactly know what they were doing, or they were employing their imagination a little bit too much, or they were going off of the ramblings of random explorers who didn't document things very well. Interestingly enough, though, author Umberto Eco has done a book considering this, called Legendary Lands, where he actually looks at many of these maps and how they either inspired human imagination or were inspired by human imagination. Recall that Umberto Eco wrote The Name of the Rose, and that he also believes that one of his family members was a foundling. Looking at the maps, though, we can see that even in this map of the North Pole, there's even the indication that there might be land up in that particular area. Of course, that is dismissed now to this day. We're told the only thing that's up there is ice, and indeed the many maps show that, along with nothing that's remotely questionable. And yes, my sarcasm meter's off the charts right now. But what really is up there? Well, apparently nothing very interesting. It's just ice, and you can take the guys from Top Gear up there and they can camp out, or you can surface a submarine through the ice. We recall the earlier Mercator map, though, that does show that there was land up there. And people will explain this, that Mercator simply didn't know what he was doing. He was going off the ramblings of explorers who didn't know what they were doing, and no one was going to possibly verify this. So use these as adequate charts of navigation, and suddenly you can explain why the Franklin expedition was lost for years in the 1850s. At least that's what we'll be told. Yet there's other depictions in maps of Verne's work which indicate a greater nature to the land, that there's other paths of access, that there's other lands that you can access, such as in Journey to the Center of the Earth. Indeed, this inspired many works all through the 20th century or the 1900s. And looking at some of the maps in terms of what's under the surface. What really is under the surface? Well, if you watch that wondrous film from the early 2000s, The Core, it'll show you exactly what's under the surface. And it's nothing particularly entertaining. I'm being facetious a little bit, but looking at some of these maps and considering that Jules Verne was one of the authors that actually explored what was under the land. I mean, is there anything under the land? Is it just dirt as far as the eye can see? Are there boreholes that go to different dimensions? Or is there something else entirely? Or is it a question we're just not supposed to ask and we're just supposed to accept the scientific explanation? There's a core down there, it generates the magnetic field, and if it gets knocked out of alignment or if there's issues with it, we may have to send an expedition down there to go restart the core. I mean, I know it's just a science fiction movie, just like this is just a science fiction story, but recall that there was once a time when they said that going to the moon was just a science fiction story and the product of wild imagination. But officially, we have been to the moon multiple times in the 1960s and the 1970s. We just can't do it now because we scrapped the technology. We had an order from the president at the time, we scrapped the technology, and even though we have more advanced computers now than we ever did, we're still trying to figure out how to do it. And you'll see the accounts of Florida and some of the interesting maps of Florida, as though Jules Verne had a special fascination with the particular area in some of his novels. And indeed, you consider the center point of Tampa. There's going to be an upcoming on-the-ground exploration of Tampa, and we're going to look at it from a fresh perspective, looking at some of the old-world constructions there. There's other maps of development that are interesting to look at within the perspective of Jules Verne's work. The development of technology, the exploration of the lands, and what's really the theme behind it. We look at these older maps and concern ourselves with how they may integrate into some of the maps that were replicated or reproduced or supposedly innovated from Verne's own works and his own explorations. No doubt this would inspire explorers such as Admiral Byrd to go seek things out in the polar expeditions, or Yuri Gagarin to go up into space and see what's really going on up there, because we have so many accounts of it. Or could this simply be referring to some other land that there's another means to access that we don't fully understand? Is that really what's being alluded to in these works? Well, you can easily dismiss this as just the product of science fiction until it's not. But we've seen many of these maps before, and we've seen many of these explorations where we have these interesting anomalies that tend to defy the traditional explanation that we're given. Why is it something applies in one situation, but it cannot apply in another situation, and yet the mainstream would tell us that it does apply in both situations? It seems to be something that comes up quite frequently. Indeed, if you read Around the World in 80 Days and actually look at some of the accounts, some of the people that are encountered and what lands they actually visit, you suddenly have a very different understanding of how the entire world may really look. Now, is that because that's how it really looks, or is that simply the method of Jules Verne's writing? Who knows for sure? There's even the interesting account of mysterious islands being found in unique locations. And we look at recent accounts of how islands just seem to have been suddenly discovered where no one knew there were islands before. This particular island that escaped Union prisoners in a Jules Verne story named Lincoln Island because Lincoln was just such an awesome president, and nobody debates that. But looking at these maps and these explorations and these colorful characters from these science fiction novels, or these children's stories as the English-speaking world regarded them, we seem to have a world that's laid out for us that's far more fantastic and far more amazing than we're led to believe. Now, is that really what it looked like? Or is there something else behind this story? Perhaps there's something more that Jules Verne was alluding to, or at least the powers that be were alluding to when they released these stories, this technology, and these accounts to us. Well, let's take a look at one final work of Jules Verne's, Master of the World. Someone was asking me on a comment about a film that concerned a great airship, and one of those films was 1961's Master of the World. Now, it should be noted the screenplay of Master of the World was done by Richard Matheson, and he combined two Jules Verne's works, Rober the Conqueror and Master of the World, into a film. The film stars Vincent Price as the character Rober, who is utilizing his airship, called the Albatross, to actually prevent civilization from having the capability to make war on itself. It's a very interesting film because it does show the employment of airships and what the technology can represent. Now, you can certainly say that Rober, the main character, who's portrayed by Vincent Price, and Vincent Price is always very entertaining to watch on screen, is merely a reflection of Captain Nemo. And while there are some similarities, there's a difference in how Rober goes about his implementation of removing the capability of society to commit war. It's also intriguing to consider that some of the cast includes Charles Bronson, so you get to see Charles Bronson go head-to-head with Vincent Price in this film. Now, the effects are very dated, but consider the time frame that this film was actually released, and also consider what this film was truly reflecting from the imagination of both Jules Verne and Richard Matheson. What were they really showing, and what were they really trying to say? The main star, of course, in addition to Vincent Price and Charles Bronson, happens to be the Albatross itself. Quite an imagination they had to depict an airship such as this, and this is one of the very centerpieces of what we consider to be the steampunk genre to this very day. And this is why Jules Verne is attributed as being the main innovator of steampunk, and also science fiction. But the film really considers the struggle of one civilization giving way to a new civilization. And why is it a new civilization is constantly at war with itself, especially in regional conflicts? And yet Rober is considered the conqueror. He's going to be master of the world with his airship, the Albatross. That gives him a military capability that exceeds the military capability of other nations. So is he really any different? It's up to Charles Bronson's character and the other cast to stop him in his dastardly deeds. Now, it may seem like it's a very simplistic film from the early 1960s, but there are some deeper themes and a lot more complexity in it, indeed as there is in the more well-known 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So it does look and give a modern incarnation of what was being written about in these so-called Victorian-era novels, and I can strongly recommend it as a film about an airship. And so let's consider the final question. Who exactly was Jules Verne? How did he actually have this capability to anticipate the technological developments that were going to headline the 1900s in the 1800s? And we look at our five eras theory, and we ponder the question. This individual who is from France, who was supposed to be a lawyer based on his family's profession, and yet he decided for himself that his profession was going to be writer. Now, it's a great story, and it's a great biography that is well documented, but if we look at this time frame, these reset years, and we look at the Victorian era or the 1800s as being set right during this time frame in which the reset between the fourth and the fifth era occur. We look at the release of all of these elements of technology, at least in terms of concepts and ideas, which did come about in the 1800s. Officially, the submarine was invented in the 1800s. It was tested and used in the United States Civil War. There's supposedly an earlier edition of the turtle in the Revolutionary War, although make of that what you will. But then it goes beyond submarines. Jules Verne wrote extensively about the concept of airships. And indeed, when you look at the aspect of Master of the World and how it was reflected in the sightings of mysterious airships at that time frame towards the late 1800s, there's suddenly many more details in these stories and what Jules Verne was trying to share with the population at that time. Now, is it because he was really creative and was brilliant that he was able to anticipate how all these technological advancements were going to come about and be integrated into civilization? Or was this really part of a controlled release of information to prepare people for what the new civilization was going to be? Let me know in the comments. Please like, comment, and subscribe.